It was January 1944. The Apennine Mountains stood silent beneath a pale dawn, their bare cypress and olive trees ghostly against the dim sky. A cold mist curled through the valley, coating the earth with ice. Corporal David Mason huddled inside the camouflage turret of his M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, breath visible in the frigid air. He watched through a frost-lined periscope, heart pounding with quiet focus. His fingers, numb from the cold, tightened on the controls. Just 700 yards ahead, a rumbling column of German armor and trucks crept along the narrow mountain road. Mason could make out the straight shoulders of Panzer IVs, and leading them all, the dark bulk of a Panther tank. Behind this deadly spear came half-tracks, bristling with infantry, fuel trucks, and ammunition lorries filling out the snake of steel. They were heading for a high crag that overlooked the main Allied supply route, a position that, if lost, would cut off the forward American forces hammering at Cassino. Orders were clear: observe, report, and do nothing else. Mason's captain had been explicit. No shots without artillery clearance, he had warned. We'll call in everything we have when you confirm their position. Otherwise, we don't fire. Outside the turret, silence reigned over the frozen hills. But inside, tension coiled tight. Mason and his two crewmates shared a wordless understanding. This column threatened everything on the front. Yet none dared break the rule. Just 3 days earlier, Mason had sat in a cold tent with the rest of his detachment at the Corps headquarters. A stern-faced colonel had laid down the law. "We don't engage moving targets until we've got the support locked in," the colonel barked, eyes scanning the grim faces of his men. "You fire early, you give away our position, and you bring down a blitz of German artillery. Understood?" The room was suffocated by cigar smoke and anxiety. Mason nodded, as he always did. He knew the rules by heart. But even then, under those gray canvas flaps, every man's knuckles whitened on rifle stocks, itching to feel the recoil of their guns against something real. Mason was no hothead. Back home on the Rocky Mountain Ranch where he grew up, he'd learned patience and precision. His father was a mechanic, and from a boy, David learned to measure twice and cut once. He could estimate the height of a grain silo by its shadow or the distance across a canyon by counting stones. When war came, he enlisted for the engineering and mechanics training the Army offered, not for battle. By now, at 24, he looked older than his years, cheeks creased by worry, a permanent layer of soot under his eyes from diesel and cordite. The war in Italy had aged him almost as much as his father's wind and sun. He'd been through the bloody slog up Sicily, through the streets of Salerno and the mountains of Calabria. He'd lost buddies to mortars and mines. His best friend in the battalion, Tommy Green, was crushed by a Sherman that rolled over him during the Gothic Line advance. Another, Luis Ortega, had vanished under artillery fire at Monte Cassino. Mason didn't trust luck anymore. He trusted math and angles and cold calculation. Over months of harsh fighting, he'd become something of a student of tactics. On long nights, he'd sketch diagrams of enemy formations, marking probable fields of fire and dead zones. He carried a pencil stub behind his ear and tiny notebook pages in his coat pocket, even when the days grew too crowded with ammo chits and duty rosters. Other soldiers called him Specs or Stu, joking that he wore glasses and reasoned like a carpenter. He didn't mind. Talking little, he let numbers and diagrams talk for him. But now words had little place in Mason's mind. Through that periscope, he saw them clearly. The Panther with its long barrel, cold and menacing. The fours behind it, row after row. The half-track nestled between, like the snake's belly, segment after segment of bullets and fuel. The problem was painfully simple. If those tanks reached the high ridge above the highway, the Allies below would be in hell. Trucks of ammunition and food would be lost. And Mason knew that one small road was literally all that stood between the front and collapse. Yet for all their might, those German vehicles were caught in a trap. The road was narrow, hemmed by steep hillsides, where only a scout or two could duck behind trees at the far edge, not enough to spread out. The half-tracks had scant room to maneuver, and even the Panther's thick armor couldn't protect it if its side was exposed. The thought that coursed through Mason's mind was terrifying and simple. He was alone. There was no radio signal. The static was so bad, even his voice at his crew's voices crackled into white noise. He could try to stand up and fire off a quick call, but he'd immediately lose his cover as the turret popped out of the netting. By the time any orders came down from battalion, it might all be over. Protocol demanded patience. But Mason realized something the colonel hadn't said. Waiting was about to be deadly. He breathed deeply to still his chattering teeth and trained the Hellcat's gun. Even then, he didn't aim at the front. In fact, he aimed at the heart. The third vehicle in the line was a Panzer IV. He knew its flank was only lightly armored, exposed on a curve of the road. If he hit it just right, it could jackknife, blocking its comrades behind. He smiled grimly behind his scarf and flicked the firing button. The Hellcat recoiled. The shell punched through the tank's side and detonated its fuel storage. Flames billowed into the sky. The sudden blast shattered the morning quiet and sent plumes of black smoke up the slope. The German column shuddered to a halt. Men screamed in alarm. As cannon fire streaked overhead, Mason's loader already had another round in place. Instead of firing at the lead or the last tank, Mason aimed at the sixth vehicle, a fuel tanker chuffing thick black smoke. Keeping low in the hatch, he squeezed off another shot. The round struck between wheels and body, igniting everything on board. A towering fireball roared up into the fog. Spent fuel and oil sprayed into the underbrush like gasoline rain. The tanker exploded with a shockwave that buckled Mason's Hellcat, and burning liquid spread across the road. The German infantry behind him panicked. Mason didn't pause to celebrate. He was shaking from exertion, from the cold, and from adrenaline mixing in his veins. The road was instantly a choke point. 4 vehicles were now stalled in twisted metal positions. Panthers and Panzers behind them lurched to a stop in confusion. The crews on top of those tanks were no longer shouting orders in German. Now they were shouting at one another, waving their arms and pointing at every movement in the thickening smoke. The master plan of a smooth push forward had melted into chaos. Mason thumbed away at a small dial, adjusting the gun's elevation for the next strike. The Hellcat already looked like a ghost tank to the Germans, a phantom battery hiding in the wood. They couldn't see its muzzle flash behind Mason's careful angles, and the snow-dusted hills swallowed most of the noise. He fired again. This time he targeted the 9th vehicle, an armored half-track that was reversing to escape the blockade. The shell drove straight through its thin roof armor. The half-track lifted and came down on its nose, burying its front wheels in the mud. The soldiers inside were thrown clear, scrambling into the trees like rats. Mason's gun was empty now, the last shell spent. He peered through the periscope. The road was a tangle of wreckage, burning fuel, twisted hulls, smoke. German ammunition cook-offs lit the valley like fireworks. All of their momentum and organization had collapsed within seconds. Back in the woods, Mason and his crew stayed low, listening to distant gunfire and the crackle of flames. "We should get out of here," his driver, Private Lopez, murmured after some tense moments. Lopez's voice was hoarse, eyes wide behind goggles smeared with soot. No response came other than the thunder of distant artillery. Mason just shook his head. Not yet. The enemy was desperately trying to coordinate a response, but each command in the German column was lost in the fog of their own panic. The Hellcat was still functional, and the firing mechanism was still hot. He could fire again if needed. Up on the road, something caught Mason's eye. The lead Panther was trying to inch backward, but it was stuck between burning hulks. Its turret swiveled wildly. The gunner trained the massive barrel toward the woods. The guttural clank of its engine roared, then died. Its gears were jammed by the wreck ahead. Mason took a slow breath and settled the crosshair on the exposed flank. He remembered one crucial fact: even the heavyweight tanks had weaknesses. As soon as that German armor spun, an opening was visible. In a heartbeat, Mason pressed the trigger again. The final shell hit home. In an instant, the Panther's turret catapulted off in a flaming cloud of shrapnel. The tank itself shuddered once and then went dead quiet. For an eternity, there was silence in the valley. The burning wrecks glowed, and black smoke settled like a low cloud over the road. Every German still alive was either hiding or running for cover. Mason climbed fully out of the hatch, not to celebrate, but to check on his boys. His loader, Sergeant Willis, gave a shaky grin. The younger crew members were stunned into silence. No one cheered or cursed. No one even laughed. They were all just thankful to be alive, adrenaline-soaked and exhausted. Mason's breath came in hot puffs. He wiped his forehead. The Hellcat's gun was cool again. He rested a hand on the barrel. Down the road, the Germans began firing wildly in the air. Their officers were certain they'd been ambushed by a full battalion of American tank destroyers. One lieutenant, captured later, claimed, "We lost count of how many guns were shooting at us from the trees." Every survivor back at the German lines told a different tall tale. Anti-tank mines hidden in the road, paratroopers with bazookas, a battalion of Shermans lying in wait. Some even thought the RAF had found and bombed them from above. No one could fathom it was just one corporal and his Hellcat. By late afternoon, elements of Mason's own company moved up the highway. They came across the scene and nearly fell silent. At first, the Americans expected a massive collision of forces had happened, but all they found were silenced German tanks and trucks, scorched to ashes. Not a single one of Mason's men was hurt. Lieutenant Colonel Harland, Mason's commander, stood near the overturned Panther and shook his head. His jaw was set, blinking smoke out of his eyes. He had heard radio chatter about a ghost battery tearing up the road, but he didn't believe it could be true. "Who did this?" he demanded, voice low. Mason stepped forward and saluted. "Just us, sir," he replied. The colonel stared for a long moment, then gave a half-smile. "At ease, Corporal." Back at the command post that night, Mason waited to be reprimanded. He expected handcuffs, or, at the very least, furious words. But Harland never scolded him. Instead, the colonel read Mason's report and nodded slowly. He absently tapped a crayon against his chin and then quietly said, "Go get some rest." The implication hung in the air. The army would sort out the rest. Mason felt sweat suddenly on the back of his neck. He understood. They weren't thanking him, but they weren't punishing him either. Not for now. In the days that followed, the legend of the ghost gunners grew. Enemy prisoners described being chased by unseen Hellcats firing from all sides. Intelligence officers interviewed Mason's crew and studied maps of the ambush. They confirmed his notes. One knockout round here, one there. Exactly in the pattern Mason had planned. There was no mystery, really. Mason had hit exactly the vehicles needed to cause a controlled collapse of the column. First the center tank, then fuel and mobility vehicles, then the lead heavy tank. The Germans' own rigid formation logic had been used against them. Mason had, with a few well-placed shells, turned that tight spear into a broken wall. It was tactics, all right, but one no officer had written in a manual. The army quietly took notice. Mason was never given a medal. Not right away, but he wasn't forgotten. Months later at Fort Bragg, instructors drew his action on chalkboards for trainee officers. How a single gunner can stall a column. They taught what they called gunnery overwatch techniques, modeled on Mason's decisions. The data showed he destroyed 5 German vehicles and bottled up 3 more. Most important, he'd saved an Allied supply road and dozens of lives. After the war, Mason went back to Montana. He married his childhood sweetheart and ran his father's old auto shop, fixing tractors and trucks. He never talked much about that day. When asked, he would only shrug and say, "I saw what needed to be done." He didn't view himself as a hero, just a guy doing his job, with a dash of math and a little nerve. Decades later, a young artillery officer happened upon Mason's declassified after-action report and wanted to learn more. He tracked down the now-retired Corporal Mason, gray-haired and still fitting parts in his garage. The officer asked how it felt to fire without orders. Mason looked up from tightening a wrench and simply said, "By the time the radio was fixed, it would have been too late." He paused, then added with a small smile, "In war, Sometimes the rules must follow what reality is showing you. To those who study small unit actions, the name David Mason is still whispered as a sort of legend. The gunner who wasn't supposed to shoot, but to Mason himself, it was just another day's math. He had seen a problem and solved it, his aim both mechanical and human. The frozen road in Italy had been saved by one unexpected deviation and a single pattern of fire. And for the men alive on the other side of that hill, that made all the difference.